John Finnegan. Welcome to Unitarian Anabaptist.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so this has been a long time in the waiting. I was interviewed by you about 8 months ago, and now you're being interviewed by the Unitarian Anabaptist. What a privilege.
I'm excited. This is
Okay.
a wonderful platform.
Oh, nice. So, there is a lot that you have to say today in the limited time that we're going to do this. You just came back from a trip, a cruise of Italy and Greece. You finished a 500-year history of the early church, and there's just so much interrelated. And what I would like to do, as we discussed earlier, is to relate these things back to the first century faith of our early Christian brethren. So to begin, could you give us a summary of the important highlights that you saw on your trip related to church history?
Yeah, absolutely. So we ended up going to a number of touristy spots in Greece, like Santorini and Mykonos, but we also hit Athens, and we came into the port of Piraeus and then got to the city of Athens. And the first thing that I will note, and anyone who's been to the Mediterranean in August will know what I'm about to say, is that it's hot. Okay. It's a very hot part of the world, and so is the Middle East. So it's interesting that, you know, like times I've been to Israel, times I've been to Greece or Turkey, it is a very different climate than what I'm used to here in New York or you in Ohio there.
Yes, absolutely.
And you know, that brings to mind the importance of water. And that's something that really stuck out to me in Israel. I would have never gotten that from reading books, but going to Israel, you go to these ancient sites and there are these cisterns dug into the ground, these huge caverns to store water because it doesn't rain that much. And so water is still a big deal in the first century. In Rome, in other cities, Pompeii, I also got to visit Pompeii.
Oh, wow.
And they brought the water in through aqueducts. And this is all part of their system of, you know, just city structure. But the question is, who pays for the aqueducts? Who pays for the bathhouses? You know, I got to see some bathhouses in Pompeii where you had the frigidorium, the tepidorium, and the calidorium. You know, and this is the really cold water, the tepid water, and the hot water. And this is just what people did. These are publicly available facilities. You know, like we say a public swimming pool by me. That just means you have to pay. But I think the general sense in the first century is that you got to go if you lived in the city. And this actually ended up having a great deal of prestige as wealthy people stepped forward. And this happened in the first century, but also in the second century was really the heyday of this period, where wealthy people would come forward and they would donate money to build these public works. And they would build other great structures like theaters and whatnot. And these would then be the ones who controlled the cities and won political office.
Okay.
And so it's a very different kind of world. You know, just like I don't think about water. I don't think about, you know, wealthy people building bathhouses or pools. Right?
Yes.
It's just we pay taxes and then we argue about the It's just a very different world, and that was really driven home to me on the trip. You know, in Athens, you're on the Acropolis and you're seeing the Parthenon and some of the other structures that still remain, and it's just like this is an utterly different world, and it's just so helpful to remember that, Tom, because we don't do that when we read the Bible. What we do is we have what we understand the world to be, and then we encounter the scripture, we read the text, and then we think to ourselves, okay, we don't even think to ourselves, it's automatic. We say, how can I incorporate this new information I'm reading about the book of Acts or one of the church epistles, for example? How do I incorporate that into what I know about the world? This is an automatic process. And the problem is, if you don't force yourself to stop and say, wait, they lived in a different world. They had different language, different politics, different weather, different everything. Then you can easily misunderstand so much of the New Testament. I think that's a lot of what we as pastors do, is we're trying to help people understand the scriptures. So the trip was really enlightening in that sense. Also, I'll make another quick point about it, is that we did manage to go to the very edge of Mount Vesuvius. Now, Mount Vesuvius blew in 79, AD 79, and that's what killed all the people in Pompeii and Herculaneum. And so they say it's still an active volcano, but you can take a bus all the way up to the top of, and then you hike until you get to the very crater, and you can look down into the crater, and it's just incredible. But it's just dirt and some like grass and stuff. There's no like lava or anything cool. But it's just a weird experience to like stand on the edge of an active volcano and think, wow, this thing blew. And you can kind of see why ancient people were like, oh, the gods are angry, right? Because like, there's no one in living memory of seeing this thing blow the last time. And, you know, it's just such an otherworldly power.
Sure. How far is Pompeii from Rome?
I think about 2 hours, if I had to guess. Something like that. So we approached Pompeii from Naples. Naples is on the coast. And, you know, came at it from the west to get to Pompeii in the east. And then you get to Vesuvius, and at the top of Vesuvius, you can see everything. You can see just miles and miles in different cities, and it's really incredible.
My, oh my. So how far did the lava have to travel to make it to Pompeii from that?
Well, they didn't get buried in lava, actually.
No?
Yeah, you would, I guess you would expect that. But it was I think it was a toxic gas.
Okay.
That swept through. Well, initially it was launching projectiles and ash and rock straight up, and then that fell because of the wind onto the city, and so there, you know, imagine like a hailstorm but with stones.
Okay.
And bigger ones and smaller ones. But then a gas came from the mountain, and I believe that's what happened, and it killed the people. But then it continued to rain ash. I think they said like 20 feet of ash.
Oh, wow.
Something crazy.
Okay.
And it just settled on the city, and people just didn't have a reason to go there for anything, or I'm not really sure why, but it just laid there century after century. And I'm not sure exactly when, maybe in the 1700s, 1800s, something around there. They're just like, hey, I think we found a city over here. You know, archaeology just finally gets started. And what happened, Tom, is they would come against these air pockets. So they're digging through, and they hit like a pocket of air, and they're like, this is so weird. What is this? And someone got the bright idea of squeezing into it some plaster.
Plaster.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Have you seen these images?
I have. Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah,
okay.
And so then they let it dry and harden, and then they chip around it, and then they see the exact shape of a human being.
Yeah.
Sometimes even with fine detail of like facial expressions and stuff. And so that's kind of become their custom, is when they hit an air cavity, they just do that. And there are lots of these casts of human beings in various positions. And what's crazy about them is it's just like a plaster, but inside the plaster are that person's actual bones.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Okay. I was going to ask. You know, something that you mentioned to me back in Louisville, Kentucky, was the length of time that bones exist.
Yeah.
And we were talking about resurrection and literal resurrection. And you mentioned that bones last a long time. That's something I really was impressed by.
Yeah, it's 'cause of
Something
the
that
calcium, I think.
Rabbi Tovia Singer was speaking out against being cremated because the bones are supposed to be the material that used for, in part anyhow, to reconstitute us as human beings in the resurrection. So that view is very Jewish in origin, as you
Yeah, I
well
tend
know.
to agree with Rabbi Tovia Singer on that. I'm not a fan of cremation. I'm not going to say it's going to defeat God's ability to resurrect somebody.
No.
I feel like that's a pretty extreme position to take. But I, have learned a lot, and I know you've been to Israel and you've stood on the Mount of Olives, and you see all the tombs there that are, I don't know why they're buried above ground, but there are all these stone rectangles and or stone boxes, really, rectangular shaped boxes, and inside are the bones. And it's like, well, what's the deal with this? Why are they so worried about bones, or not worried, but concerned about bones and focused and about caring for the bones? And they have these ossuaries where they found Caiaphas's ossuary.
I know. I saw it when I was in Israel.
Incredible.
In the Israel Natural History Museum of all places, back in 2004, I was shocked.
Isn't it beautiful?
Well, it's a beautiful ossuary, but what was most shocking was the plaque beside it.
What did it say?
The plaque beside it said, "This was the high priest in the days of Jesus that was responsible for his crucifixion." And I thought to see that advertised in the Israel Natural History Museum was just shocking because it's a recognition that this thing happened and this is the man responsible to it. That was the last thing I saw in the museum on my way out because we had a very short time frame, and it was at the entrance of the museum. So we saw it as we exited.
Very cool. Very cool. And when you see that stuff, you just say to yourself, these are real. These are true stories. These are this is history. You see the lithostratos. That street that is beneath Jerusalem. That was discovered where they think maybe this is where Jesus was beaten or he was. It's the layer that goes back to the first century. It's kind of like underneath the city of Jerusalem. You see these things, and you say to yourself, I've stood there, Tom. Like I know for sure now, Vesuvius is a real volcano. I looked into the crater.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
It's like not that I ever really doubted it, but like when you do it and you stand there and you see and you see the cast and the horror on the faces of the people in Pompeii, you're like, okay, this is not a story. No. This is history. Right. And it's very powerful. But back to your point about resurrection and bones, what really started me on this is going to be a really random source, is a Freakonomics podcast episode. I think it was Freakonomics. It might have been another another podcast. They're talking about cremating animals. I think it was Freakonomics. And the guy was saying that when it comes to cremating animals, they were trying to do an investigation. Actually, it might not have been Freakonomics. It might have been Planet Money or some other podcast that was popular a few years back. And the big question they had was, do they actually give you the ashes for your animal? This was like a pet crematorium. Or are they just like scooping random ashes and, what's really going on here? Right. And they were talking, so they got into the subject of cremation and bones. And they're like, well, what really happens in a crematorium is they burn the human or the animal or whatever, and then the bones are there. Right. Their bones are not burnable. They're just there. Right. So what they do is they grind them. That's what Tovia said too. And after they grind them down, that's the ashes that you get. They're actually ground bones. Oh, is that right? And it's like, okay. So it's actually not the ash material itself, it's the ground bones. Well, it's very ashy because it's been like subjected to insane heat. Yeah. Right? So it's very dried out, very ashy, but like it's ground up bones that they return to you. At least that's what this podcast episode was saying. And it was talking about animals, but like it also talked about humans, whatever. And it made me think to myself, like, wait a second. I always just assumed the bones desiccated. I assumed that they disintegrated over time. And then it kind of informed my thinking about, the James ossuary and the Caiaphas ossuary and some of these other ossuary findings, like some of the more sensationalized ones that said we think we found Jesus and all this, which has been pretty much not accepted by scholarship. But anyhow, the idea of bones lasting for centuries and centuries was just like common sense to ancient people, because they didn't have this separation like we have from our dead. Like we don't know, but like they would go a year later back to the tomb, and they would pick up the bones and put them in a little bone box. So that there was like,
so that would have been exclusive to Israel, or not? Would that have been exclusive to the Jews, or would that have been in other cultures too?
I don't know if other people did it too, but I can tell you this: in the first century in Jerusalem, this was super common.
Yes, I know that.
Yeah, space is limited, and you want to fit as many ancestors, descendants, relatives in the same cave or tomb as possible. But you're not looking to like mix all the bones together.
Yeah.
It just kind of made sense to get a box the width of a skull and the length of a femur, and to use that to, organize people and just scratch on the side the person's name.
Yeah.
And so I think this all goes back to whether we're talking about the Mount of Olives to this day in Jerusalem, or we're talking about the ossuaries from the first century, or Tovia Singer's preferences. This all goes back to the same thing, which is this really strong belief in resurrection. And so burying your dead in a way that preserves the bones or cares for the bones is in a sense, I think, an act of faith that the Jewish people have always had. Again, I'm not saying that cremation is a sin or that it's going to damn somebody to, eternal judgment, or, that's not where I'm going here.
No.
But I think we should ask the question, does this really fit as Christians? Like, I know it's less expensive, okay? But like, is that always the right course of action just because something's less expensive? So I think traditional burial is it can be an act of faith, because you're saying, I'm in a marked tomb, and I'm going to rise out of this tomb. Mm-hmm.
You might even question whether or not all the preservation techniques are really necessary too. But that's another topic for another day. Yes.
Yeah.
So just as you're talking about this, I'm thinking to myself, most crucified men were thrown into a pit. Is that accurate? Like the men that were, would that be safe to say, or not necessarily? Would the bodies of crucified men outside of Jerusalem been given back to their families, or were they disposed of in some other way? And if you don't know the answer, that's okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is on that. I do remember reading a book by John Dominic Crossan, and he was making the case that criminals were thrown into a common grave. I guess I would want to look in Josephus to see how he describes those crucified in the Jewish war, but I would be hesitant to think that necessarily implies that that's standard operating procedure, because people crucified in wartime and by the hundreds is not necessarily applicable to 3 people crucified as opposed to 300 people crucified. Like if you have 100 or more people crucified, you're going to use a common grave, right?
Yes.
So I think I'd want to see the evidence one way or the other.
Okay.
The historical primary sources.
I appreciate your honesty in that. So let's get back to your trip details. I'm trying to picture the framework of, picture the setting that the Acts of the Apostles was written in. Is Athens set on a hill?
Well, the Acropolis certainly is.
The Acropolis is, okay.
Yeah. There are definitely hills there. The Acropolis is a very high point in the center of Athens, and it is a very kind of steep, I don't know what you call it, like a plateau that just rises out of nowhere. And I think in the old days, that would be the spot where you would retreat to if Athens were invaded, because it can be held much longer.
Okay. So the Apostle Paul preached in that place? Is that correct?
I think he preached at Mars Hill, which is right next to it. So it's right nearby.
Okay, when you say nearby, is it included in the Acropolis, or is it some other location?
I think it's right next to it.
Right next to it. Okay.
Yeah.
So how does that? Can you imagine the Apostle Paul in that setting? Can you picture him there?
The interesting thing about the Apostle Paul at the Areopagus or Mars Hill is that he is looking at all these statues. And when I was in Athens, I got to go to the museum, the Athens, the Acropolis Museum, which is also right next to the, maybe like a short walk. And we got there and we went inside, and you see all these statues. And these are all these statues that they found. Of course, the Acropolis had actual temples to gods on it, and that wouldn't have been unusual. There would be temples and statues of gods all throughout the city. And that's not weird for Athens either. All Greco-Roman cities had statues to gods, shrines, little other ways of worshiping their gods. Depending on what gods we're talking about, they're all a little different. But there's Paul. He's not really from the West. And for his perspective, as somebody from Tarsus and Cilicia, Athens is the West.
Okay.
We would say Athens is east from us, but for him that's the West. And so for Paul, he would have seen plenty of this throughout his travels and stuff, but for whatever reason, his heart was just so troubled in Athens. He saw the people just in the city just given to this in Acts 17, and he finds this altar to the unknown God, and he's like, all right, well, here's some place where I can hook on a gospel presentation and really get speaking. But it's interesting, too, going back to our former conversation about burial and resurrection and Tovia Singer. When it comes to the part where Paul says that God has furnished proof by raising that Jesus is the Messiah, by raising him from the dead, the Athenians had no trouble hearing that Jesus would be the Messiah. I don't think that was like a really understood category to them. They wouldn't have a hang-up about that as him being a king or whatever. But when he says he has given proof by raising him from the dead, suddenly they're just like, this is ridiculous. Everybody knows you don't want your body back again. This is stupid. I'm out of here. And the Greeks, their standard approach to the afterlife was to get rid of the body. It was not to keep the body or to get the body back restored and renewed. So this was always a big issue between Jews and Christians agree on this over against the Greco-Roman, whether the philosophers or just like the folk religion of like going down to Hades and all the stuff they had stories about all that.
Oh, there's something I have a big interest to ask. Have you been to Caesarea Philippi in Israel?
Yeah, isn't that don't they call that Banya or something?
Banyas.
Yes.
Banyas. And actually, I don't know if you know why it's called Banyas.
Well, there was a shrine to the god Pan there, right?
Pan, right. So the original name was Panyas, but the Arabs have a hard time pronouncing the P sound. So they changed it to Banyas, believe it or not. But yes, it's Panyas.
Well, that makes sense. Thank you.
So now you learned something from me for a change, right?
There it is. There it is. Yeah, okay. I have been there. It's a beautiful spot. And, again, talking about the heat and the arid climate of Israel, to have a place with a beautiful water supply.
Oh, my.
Like Caesarea Philippi, where you say, okay, this is going to be a big spot. This is going to be a place where people are
Yes.
going to want to go
Yes.
and build things and live because there's plenteous water.
Yeah, it's beautiful there, isn't it? It's probably
Yeah.
it's probably maybe the most beautiful place in Israel in my view, as far as the physicality of it.
Yeah.
That's
I don't
arguable,
know. I
but-
loved En-Gedi. I thought it was.
And Getty was beautiful too.
Yeah.
Also water there as well.
It's interesting. My neighbor is a retired Baptist pastor.
Oh,
And yeah, so some years ago when I was going on this trip to Israel that I went on, I talked to him about it, and he's like, "Oh, did you go to Banyas? Did you go to Caesarea Philippi?" I said,
Okay.
"Yeah, I went, and I didn't have like a big spiritual experience there or anything. I was just like, oh, this is cool. I don't know about this pan stuff. That's a little weird,
yeah.
whatever." And he's just like, that place was life-changing for me. Just the serenity of it.
oh,
And reading, because that's, I think, where Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?"
right, exactly.
That he was kind of away from the hustle and the bustle,
Yeah.
and he was in this isolated place. So, it was funny because, like, different people will have those spiritual experiences in different locations, right?
When you say it was isolated, I really wonder, like, that was a capital city at the time. So Herod's brother, Philip, was reigning from that place.
Yeah.
And I walked through
I mean, maybe the word isolated isn't right, but not Jewish.
it wasn't Jewish. Yeah.
So, like, you have a little separation.
Okay. Yep. That'd be safe. So there.
I don't think Philip even pretended to be Jewish.
No, I don't think so either. But there the city location is very close to this waterfall and the shrine. So do you remember what the shrine of Pan looked like, and with the details about what was happening there?
No. Remind me.
So there's a graven image of Pan on the wall of the side of Mount Hermon, the base of Mount Hermon there, and there is a cave right next to it. And there would have been an altar, if I remember correct, there would have been an altar in front of the cave, and they were doing sacrifices to the god Pan, and they were throwing the sacrifice beast into the cave. And the Jordan River begins flowing from that area. So there was some kind of a relationship to throwing the sacrifice into the cave and whether or not the blood came out at the mouth of the Jordan River. Yeah. So there was that kind of relation, but there were that cave on the side of the mountain, Mount Hermon, was supposed to be the gateway to the underworld.
Ah.
Yes.
Yep.
So Jesus is making this presentation apparently very close to this Greek shrine and this underworld area, which is really kind of a strange setting in my view. And I don't know how quite, how you would relate to it. I thought maybe you might have given some thought to that relationship, but apparently this information is somewhat new to you.
Well, I remember the cave, and I don't know if I remember the whole story you told about the sacrifices, but it is certainly the case that the Greeks and the Jews looked very differently at the dead. Mm-hmm. The Jewish mindset was that the dead are resting, and they had the term Sheol for that. The sort of realm of the dead, where all the dead are. They're awaiting. They're asleep. They use that language a lot.
Yes.
Even in the Christian New Testament, tons of references. A lot of our translations just like get rid of it and they say died or something like that. But
yes.
It actually says fall asleep or fell asleep. Which a Greek person wouldn't say that. They would say no, they're in a different realm, and they're in the underworld of Hades. And Hades is not just a realm; it's also the name of a god who's in charge of all of those shades or departed souls. And so like these are very different views. You know what I mean? And sad to say, but Christianity has more often than not agreed with the pagans over against the Christian, the early Christian view.
Unfortunate, indeed.
Which is a shame, right?
Yes, it is. So I just, I noticed in the first conversation I had with Tovia Singer, we hit upon so many touch points that we agree upon. Resurrection, life in the age to come. The term Messiah is something that we can talk freely about. So there's so many things from my Christian view that actually are terms that you can talk to Jewish people in this present day about, especially those who are inclined to study the Old Testament. And that's a conversation that most nominal Orthodox kind of Christians cannot have with Jewish people. They would actually, the rule seems to be that Jews have to leave Judaism in order to come over to Christianity. But strangely enough, we received Christianity from the Jews. And, and so the context that you're seeing here is something that is very interesting in restoring Christianity to its first century foundations, which is your big desire.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm all about, is trying to clear away the accretions of the Middle Ages and the post-Christian developments and getting back to that original, earlier version of apostolic Christianity. What would the church have thought about this in the first century rather than in the second and following centuries, the subsequent centuries? And, I'm not against technology or innovation, but I am against changing our beliefs from what the New Testament says. And that has happened a lot. And it happens very slowly. And really, I've had a desire to understand that development for a long time, and did my master's on the subject, and was really surprised to see that people are just not asking this question. Like I'm a member of even to this day of the Boston area Patristic Society. Okay, and so I get emails and invitations to attend their meetings, which I attended when I lived out there, and they're held either at Harvard or at Brown University, or sometimes at Providence College as well. As three schools have good patristics, good early church history programs.
Oh.
And, so they issue these papers a couple times a year. I don't know, like 3 or 4 to 5 times a year. And, you have Lindt chocolates and a little wine, a little cheese, and, you sit around and, just kind of listen in with these, somebody presents on some aspect, some facet of early church history.
Yes.
And they like, I've been a member of this for, a decade. They have never done a doctrine. Not once.
Wow.
Not once. There's no interest at all in doctrinal development or this mindset that says, hey, let's get back to living out our faith the way they lived out theirs, as far as how we treat people or how we think about the government or whatever practical area. There's zero interest in that. In the I don't know what like the more liberal side of the fence, and then on the conservative side of the fence, you have the Catholics that really dominate, and not that there aren't liberal Catholics, I'm sure there's plenty of them too, but I'm talking about the more conservative-minded ones, and they're always just trying to show that what the church teaches now is really what Christians have always believed. So it's apologetic. It's not, okay, let's see what happened. It's more like, all right, well, this person, like, for example, Ignatius of Antioch, there's going to be an amazing presentation on this at the Unitarian Christian Alliance Conference next month. Nathan Massey's done some cutting-edge research on Ignatius of Antioch. But anyhow, Catholic scholars in particular, love Ignatius, and they'll go to Ignatius and they'll say, well, see, Ignatius says, Ignatius calls Jesus God, therefore the Trinity is true as we, 20 centuries later teach it. It's all true because Ignatius said Jesus is God. And there's just more problems with that than you can shake a stick at, which, I won't get into unless you're interested. But like my point is, there's very few scholars who are honestly going to the sources of ancient Christians, whatever books have survived, right? And saying, what were they saying? And just taking them on their own words, their own terms, and allowing them to like express themselves in a I don't know what the word would be, like maybe like giving them the credit that they knew what they were talking about, even if it disagrees with what the church later said was the right way to think.
Yeah.
Right. So let me just give you one example. So for example, Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr doesn't fit with anybody, right? I mean, he's just a total, he's idiosyncratic. He has his own way of thinking and talking about things. And so he will even call Jesus a second God sometimes. And, he doesn't think at all that Jesus, even in his pre-incarnate state, was equal with God the Father ever. And at the same time, he's sort of like very much like enmeshed with the Jews and like very much talking to the Jews, and at the same time, incredibly rude. And by what I would say, it's totally inappropriate. In some of the ways he talks to in one of his books, the book against Trypho.
Oh, Trypho.
So, So anyhow, Justin Martyr, a church historian will come along and say, Justin Martyr was just, he was reaching in the dark for the doctrine of the Trinity. He just didn't quite have the language yet to express it. And it's like, no, he wasn't. He had a mature, developed view of who he thought Jesus was, and it's just different than yours, man. Just allow him to be him.
They want to squeeze everybody into the same mold, huh?
He's not hinting at anything. He thinks he knows what he's talking about. You're not
right. He wore the philosopher's robe, didn't he?
He did, and he had a little meeting spot in Rome above above a shop. He had a little apartment or whatever, and he'd meet with people and he'd teach them what he thought was the definitive understanding of the Christian religion. Just because nobody else later on agrees with him doesn't mean he was just like he was like undeveloped or something. He believed what he believed, and it's just different, and that's okay. And what I see when I look at Justin or Irenaeus or a lot of these guys is I see development. And when I see development, I think to myself, let's roll back the tape and see the trajectory over time.
Yeah.
What is the vector? Where is this heading? So if I see, a couple of points on a line that go in one direction, I can say, okay, I make a measurement here, make a measurement here, connect those dots and trace it backwards. What's there in the first century?
Okay.
And that's what I love to do. That's what I want to know. That's my research, my investigation, to find out what's the earliest beliefs and practices. And then I'm crazy enough to think we can live that out today.
Yeah, you are a strange bird. But I agree with you. I guess I am too. So, yeah.
Well, and the thing is, we both came to this from very different milieus, different backgrounds, denominations, and so forth. But we both recognize that it makes logical sense that if the church has gotten off track, then the best way to do it is to reform back to the whatever we can recover of the original version of Christianity. And
that's true. Yeah,
it makes sense to me. A lot of people don't believe in restorationism. They say, oh, you can't go back there, it's impossible. And it's like, well why?
Well, let me share with you my thought on this. So the first century church was waiting for the return of Jesus. And it didn't happen in their age. But we who claim to desire the return of Jesus need to be postured as they were. Like, I'm just wondering, if Christianity gets far enough away from their origins, it's an awful lot to ask Jesus to return when we've strayed so far from what our forefathers believed. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, he also is going to include those who have fallen asleep, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So I think he'll still have a base of people that know what's going on.
Yes, I'm confident of that. Yes,
might be an extensive training session to get started, like orientation. when you go to college or something.
So the church that I was put out from is called the Apostolic Christian Church Nazarene. And the term Nazarene is a term that is very, very, very honorable, I would say. But when we think in terms of the early church, the term Nazarene meant Jewish believers in Messiah. And I still call myself a Nazarene, even though my community has, by and large, has disfellowshipped me. I like to trace my origins back to the Nazarenes, my Jewish brethren, believers in Jesus. And this is something that you touched upon in your church history. You think you could fill us in a little bit about the views of different Jewish Christians, Ebionites, Nazarenes, and any others that would kind of fit that category? Maybe give us a little summary.
Yeah. To do work on the Ebionites or the Nazarenes is to almost, well, I think, pretty much exclusively read late reports by their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of a single document that survives, other than I would argue the Didache. I would say the Didache is a Nazarene document.
Oh, wow.
It reads that way to me. It has a low Christology. It's very Jewish. It's very Christian. And it just seems to kind of fit that mindset. So I would argue that the Didache would be a Nazarene document. Now, these terms, Nazarene, it's actually in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The sect of the Nazarenes.
Right.
Where was
Paul.
that?
Paul
they
was
said that about Paul, right?
Yes, they did. That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's old school, right? But what we can kind of gather is from these late reports, and when I say late, I'm talking like from the year 375. We get this heresy hunter named Epiphanius of Salamis, and he writes a book called the Panarion, and so this is writing 300 years after all the action and the excitement has already happened, right?
Yeah.
Where's the action? Where's the parting of the ways, as James Dunn's famous book called it? Well, it's really in that post 70 AD, pre-Justin. So like between like 70 AD when the temple got destroyed and the Romans conquered Jerusalem, to the time of Justin Martyr, where like he begins in maybe like 135 was the second revolution, right? So you have the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Yes.
Actually, some people might call it the third revolution because there was another one in between the two, but whatever. It wasn't.
Oh, there was. Okay. Oh.
But in that period there, what is that, like probably like 60, 70 years, something happened. And there was a splitting away, and Christians, Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians stopped influencing each other.
Oh.
And it's a really murky period of time. Scholars have all kinds of theories, from there was never a parting of the ways, what are you talking about, to it happened because of this or because of that. But let's just put it this way. The official Christian line on it has always been, since the time of Eusebius, that the followers of Jesus, when they saw the Roman legions coming, abandoned the city of Jerusalem. And if that's true, and he says they went to Pella, they went to this other area. If that's true, then the native Jewish people who stayed and fought and died, and then many of them also survived, would not very much like the Jewish Christians.
No.
Because they didn't stay.
So you're talking from 70, you're talking about from 70 AD that the Christians would have left.
Yeah, so like after the city is conquered by the Romans, things kind of settle down politically. I mean, I guess the last holdouts are at Masada up until like 73, 74. But like other than that, this period ends, the Romans have reasserted their dominance, but a lot of Jewish people survive, and they're not looking at the Jewish Christians positively. They're looking at them negatively, and we have this Birkat Hamanim.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that?
I am. Isn't that from Bar Kokhba?
I don't know if it's from Bar Kokhba or not, but it is something that,
or was that developed
around that time? So very much could be from that.
Yes.
But it says, "For the apostates, let there be no hope, and uproot the kingdom of arrogance speedily, and in our days may the Nazarenes and the sectarians perish as in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of life," and so forth. So it's like, okay. By the time of Justin, he makes mention of this.
Oh.
And he says, why are you guys cursing us in your synagogues? Right? So like Justin knows about it. So it's got to be before 160. And it's probably after Jerusalem.
Would that curse be specific to Jewish believers in Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua, or would it? Yeah, it was specifically for them because they were thought to be traitors.
They would be the ones to go to the synagogue. So this is something that would be spoken publicly in the synagogue, along with the other blessings.
So that would discourage them from attending synagogue then.
It would expose them as well, because they wouldn't be able to recite
that. They wouldn't be able to recite it.
You can't curse yourself. That's just awkward.
Right. Yes.
Right?
So during the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish believers in Yeshua, Jesus, would not have taken up arms against the Romans, and this would have been a further offense against the revolutionaries, against the Jews.
We see rumblings even before in the I don't know if it's the Jewish War or the Antiquity of the Jews with Josephus. He talks about how there was a power vacuum just for a moment in Jerusalem. And during that power vacuum, when the old governor had, I don't know if he died or just had left or whatever happened to him, but the new governor, I think it was Albinus, was on his way, then the Jewish, the non-Christian Jewish people were able to gang up on James, and when James was fairly old, the brother of Jesus, and that they were able to more or less lynch him. They just got a mob together, and they were able to kill him. And so there was already animosity before the war. The war starts in 66, and it did blow up from time to time. We see it in the book of Acts, right? There's a lot of animosity between the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish, or the non-Christian Jews. So this continues, but after the war, it seems like there's not even much real space left for Jewish Christians to even go to a synagogue with this curse that's put there specifically against them. And again, the war is such a massive historical event, the Jewish War with Rome, 66 to 74, where how many kinds of Judaism do we know about from the first century? You have your Sadducees, you have your Essenes, you have the rebellious types, they call the fourth philosophy in Josephus, and you have your Pharisees, and then you have the Christian Jews.
Would there be the Zealots or the Sicarii?
Yeah, that would be the fourth philosophy, the Zealots, the Sicarii, all the revolutionary types, right? So you have like 5 types of Judaism, and so the Christian Jews survive, and the Pharisaic Jews survive, but the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the revolutionaries, they're all gone. Or completely disempowered. After the war. So now you have Pharisaic Judaism, which eventually kind of develops into Rabbinic Judaism. And you have the Jesus Jews, and they gave birth to the Christian movement, which is kind of like, it's almost like, in a sense, gone public, like a corporation offers an IPO, and then like the company has kind of a life of its own, independent of what the founder really, his vision was. And maybe that's a good analogy for it, because Christianity goes pretty much Gentile, and there's Jew and Gentile together in the first century for sure. But like as we get into the second century, the kinds of literature that survive from Christian pens, it's just like either ignorant of Jewish
Wow.
practices and interpretations of the Old Testament, or outright antagonistic, where you get like documents from like the middle of the 2nd century. Like I'm thinking of the Epistle of Barnabas and some of the other documents in the Apostolic Fathers, where like they're just like, you Jews are crazy because you kept the law. And it's like, how could you ever say that if you're if you're a little more aware of what that was the law that God gave to the Jewish people to keep? Why would they be crazy to keep it?
Right.
So it seems like there's just a parting of the ways, and that's the term James Dunn used for it. And we just wish so much that we had more information about it. We just kind of get these little bits and pieces. We don't know exactly how it happened. We just know
from
that it happened.
hostile witnesses of all places.
So now you've got these Jewish Christians, Tom, and they're kind of isolated in the East, and they're not well loved by the Gentile Christians, or they don't have access, or I don't know, for whatever reason. There's just not a lot of interaction, which is tragic in my opinion.
Absolutely.
But they're also alienated from their own Jewish brothers and sisters, because they're not allowed in the synagogue. And if you're in a little village and there's only one place putting shoes on horses or doing some other craft or trade, and they don't want to sell to you, guess what? You're in trouble.
Yes.
Because you're one of the Nazarenes or one of the Ebionites.
Sure.
So, these people had a really tough go of it. And, we hear about them later on. And they may have survived pretty well outside the Roman Empire in the East, in the Persian Empire, but we don't know much about that either. So it's really hard to do scholarship on them. There are more questions than answers, but my best guess, okay, and that's really what it is. This is a guess, is that the community of James, the brother of Jesus, they didn't really get on board with what Paul and Gentile Christianity was doing. They got on board to a certain degree. And we see this conflict in the book of Acts 15, and then later on in 22. And so what happens is they say, all right, well, you can have Gentiles and they don't need to keep the law. It's fine. But we Jews are going to keep the law still. I don't think Paul got on board with that. I think Paul didn't think... I think Paul would say Jews don't need to keep the law either. Obviously, they can. Anybody can keep the law who wants to.
Sure.
Jewish Christians, I should be clear. I'm not talking about just Jews in general. I'm saying Jews who believe in Jesus, because of a covenantal understanding expressed later in the book of Hebrews, whoever wrote Hebrews, that it is clear that Jewish Christians don't need to keep the law. James and his group of Jewish Christians disagree with that viewpoint. They say, no, this is the covenant. We're Jewish Christians. We're going to continue to keep the law. So I think this James community is what left during the war and survived north and east of Jerusalem. And that then this community had a doctrinal division where some of them accepted the Gospel of Matthew, which possibly was in Hebrew or Aramaic, some language that the people could readily read.
Okay.
There are lots of hints of that in the patristic literature. People talk about it quite a bit. They don't talk about any other writing from the New Testament. All the other books of the New Testament, they never mention as being in Hebrew. Matthew. It's the only one.
Just Matthew, huh?
Yeah. So why would you put it in Hebrew? Whether it was written in Hebrew originally or translated into Hebrew, why? Because you have Jewish people reading it. You read the Gospel of Matthew. What does it begin with? A genealogy. Who loves genealogies? The Greeks? No, they don't care about genealogies. The Jews love genealogies. So Matthew begins by making a convincing argument that this Jesus of Nazareth has a claim and could possibly be the Messiah because of his ancestry. That's how it starts.
Okay.
So you've got this community, and in the Gospel of Matthew, as well as Luke, you have the virgin birth. You have the virgin conception, and this idea that in some way Jesus is the Son of God. Some of the Jewish Christians in this community don't believe that, and others do. And that is, and again, this is a reconstruction based on hostile sources like Epiphanius and Eusebius And there are plenty of later ones too, like Jerome mentions this stuff. And it's even possible that these Jewish Christians survived and there was some interaction with them. It wasn't just all hearsay, okay? But it's possible for us to know today how reliable these reports are. But so you have the James Jewish Christians. They go away from Jerusalem and they settle in north and east of Jerusalem, and they have this difference among them. The ones who believe in the virgin birth are Nazarenes. Mm-hmm. The ones that do not are Ebionites. Both of them believe that Jesus is a human being,
right,
whom God anointed as the Messiah. They both believe in crucifixion, both believe in resurrection, both believe in ascension, both believe in the coming kingdom.
Yes.
So the question is, whether he is biologically, whatever that means, like if there was this miracle to get him started, or if he was the son of Joseph. Okay, so that seems to be the disagreement there between the Nazarenes and the Ebionites. And here's just one more thing to complicate it, make it worse, is some Christians will call both groups Ebionites. Yeah,
that's a mistake.
And they'll say, well, some Ebionites believe this, and some Ebionites believe that.
Yes.
It's like,
right. Well, it just so happens that it seems to me the very, very important doctrines they agreed upon. And I noticed in the Apostle Paul's writing, he never mentions a virgin birth. He does emphasize the authority that Jesus received through the resurrection, most notably in Romans chapter 1. So that's where...
Yeah, I mean, I think the closest Paul comes is Galatians 4:4, where it says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Sort of like the closest to it. You could interpret that a number of different ways.
So it's fascinating to understand that we've actually lost connection with, to a large extent, to the original source of our gospel message. And I suppose that makes your challenge of restoring first century Christianity even a bigger task. You're trying to recreate these things based on what you know and based on hostile witness accounts. But
I mean, here's the good news. We still have the Bible. We have the New Testament. Yes. We can read it, we can see, and it's not like the New Testament is hiding or covering over any controversy. Like the Paul James things is plain as day in Galatians. Like
yes.
Paul lays it out, and I'm going with Paul on this. I'm gonna disagree with James. I think he was a great man, but I think he just didn't have the full understanding of how Jesus, through his actions, how he affected our relationship with God and this whole understanding of covenant. So I'm going to go with Paul on that. But, I think what happened among Pauline Christianity is a development that slowly moved away from the New Testament written from a Jewish, or read from a Jewish perspective, because I think Pauline Christianity basically got swamped by Gentiles.
Yeah, I think so too.
And I think the leaders of Pauline Christianity, probably not in his day, but maybe within a generation or two, became highly educated, intellectual Gentiles who were financially well off enough to get an education, because education costed money. Otherwise, you got to farm, or you got to do a craft or a trade, right?
Yes.
So as that sort of movement occurred away from apostles and their appointed successors, more towards these intellectuals, we get Christian doctrine shifting away from what's in the New Testament into these more Greek and Roman ways of thinking. And that's kind of an area where I've been doing a lot of work recently, trying to understand, especially on Christology, how would a Greek or a Roman person, how would they hear the story of Jesus? What would that sound like to them? And so I've done a lot of work on that, and I'm going to be presenting that in a month as well. at the
At the
UCA
conference.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that should be very
but that'll
interesting.
be out later on YouTube as well if you don't make it to the conference.
I bought my ticket already.
Oh, good.
Yes. Yes, I'll look forward to that. I guess we probably shouldn't talk too much about it in advance because we don't want to take the thunder out of your presentation.
Well, I'll just mention one thing. Okay. So let's imagine let's imagine you're a non-believer, you're a pagan, you've worshipped the gods all your life. You've heard stories about Apollo getting banished or down to earth and having to work as a servant. You've heard stories about Zeus coming down, impregnating women. You've heard stories about
Hercules' dad, huh? Hercules' dad?
You've heard stories about Hercules as well. And, Asclepius was originally a human who got deified. And he got deified to such a level that he became essentially an Olympian god. That level of elevation and exaltation was possible. So you hear all these stories about these gods who come down to become men or appear as men, being made in appearance as a man, right?
Yes.
Like this is their vocabulary. That's their world. And then you hear lots of stories about humans who had a beginning, normal humans, but were so exceptional that they got to skip Hades and instead go to Olympia or instead go to some heavenly realm. This is just your world. These are all your stories. Now you're going to hear a story about a miracle worker, a Jewish miracle worker who was executed, came back to life, and now lives in heaven and is immortalized. You have a category for that kind of a being.
Okay.
It's called a god.
Yeah. Yes.
Like in our language today, we would say a lowercase g God.
Yes.
Right? They didn't fuss with capital and lowercase. Like everything's capital pretty much in all the inscriptions we have in the manuscripts from this period, right? So they would just say, I know plenty of other beings that are like that too. Yeah, they're called gods.
Okay.
And so you're trying to say that Jesus is a man and now he's become a god. And so like you could just imagine an evangelism encounter going like that.
Yes.
And if you don't have that Jewish sensibility to say, well, hold on a second. There's only one God, and that's the supreme God who created everything. You can just see like Christians saying, well, yeah, I guess so. Like in that way of thinking, yeah, he's a God. So now people start calling Jesus God. And now the question becomes, well, in what sense is he God? Does he have a beginning before he was a human? And you're just operating in a totally foreign worldview, mindscape, than the Jewish mode, which is the Jewish mode they see Jesus doing miracles and they say how great it is that God has given such authority to men. Mm-hmm. What do they say when they see a miracle in the book of Acts? When Paul and Barnabas,
the gods are come down to us. The gods are come down to us.
That's what they said.
Right,
that's what they believed could happen, right?
And so when they said they weren't, when they said they weren't
have
gods,
two different thought worlds that are combining in weird and innovative ways, and that's just like one step along the path that leads to the doctrine of the Trinity, which doesn't really get fully developed until the late 4th century.
So Paul is trying to emphasize that Jesus is a human being, a second Adam. So that has a different flavor to it. Like Paul is using the first Adam story to introduce the second Adam. And this is a glorified human being who is residing in heaven until God sends him back. That's a different category, isn't it, for the Greco-Roman mind?
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to them. That's just weird. That's like resurrection. Like, why do you want your body back? And what did Christianity do with that one? We got rid of it. Mm-hmm. You go to any funeral, like unless it's somebody from my own group of churches, network of churches, or maybe like one or two other denominations, right? Like you go to a funeral, 99% of the funerals you go to, they say this person is now in heaven, and their soul, whatever, They make up all this stuff. It sounds just like the Greco-Roman stuff from the ancient times. It doesn't sound like the Bible.
Right.
Not to me.
Yes. So how can you imagine sitting in the audience when Paul was preaching from the Acropolis? What would you have, can you put yourself in the shoes of a Greek sitting in the audience hearing this message for the first time? And the setting. What would have impressed you, or what you already mentioned this earlier, but like if you as an individual were doing this, what would be going through your mind given your background and context?
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding going on, and that's just normal. We shouldn't be upset about that. We should expect that. I think we see the same thing today in the 21st century, where you try to explain something and somebody just doesn't get it who's not a Christian. And I think that's what was happening here. And what happened is Paul is evangelizing people. He's talking to people in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. His
Jewish sensibilities, I think, are offended by seeing a city full of idols. It's just, as somebody who was raised with the Ten Commandments, it's offensive. I mean, it's offensive to most Christians. Well, I don't say most, but many Christians today are offended by seeing idols and statues and seeing people actually worshiping them. So Paul is very disturbed by this, and he's trying to help. He's reasoning in the synagogue and also in the marketplace every day. You've got the Epicureans, you've got the Stoics there, and then they say, this is Acts 17:18, he says, he seems to be a preacher of foreign deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection.
Okay.
And see, the word resurrection there is anastasia. It's a Greek word that it means it means resurrection. Stand up again. But it seems like, and I think some translations might do it this way, that they're thinking that Jesus is one divinity, and they think that Paul's saying that Jesus is a divine being, which is interesting, right, in light of what I said just a minute ago. And then the other thing, they think resurrection is another divinity, right? So there's just misunderstandings all over the place. They're like, it seems like he's bringing in some new gods. Let's go hear what these new gods have to say. He's kind of like, you remember back in the old days, kids would collect baseball cards?
Uh-huh.
Or like when my kids were little, it was Pokemon cards, and you trade with each other. This one, it's like gods to the Athenians. They're like, oh, you've got that. Tell me about that god. Let me tell you the story about this one.
Yes.
So they're interested, and they put them up there, and they say, okay, what is this new teaching? Tell us what this is all about, right? And so we know there's going to be misunderstanding. We know there's going to be confusion, but that's no reason not to get started. And so he does. He starts in a very friendly and flattering way, right?
Yeah.
And he says, I
poets,
perceive you're religious. What's that?
He used their own poets, their own poetry.
Yeah. So, I think, he's building the bridge as much as he can to their thought world, but at the same time, he's so disturbed by the idolatry that like he just wants to hit that, he's just, and it's not out of a sense of superiority. I think it's a sense of empathy and compassion. And so he just starts in with like explaining who God is. And he's like, there's a God above everything else that made everything else. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't need you. He doesn't need you to offer animals. And he believed in animal sacrifice. I don't know if he still believed in animal sacrifice or not, but he believed in it at least most of his life. And still, he's just like, look, he doesn't need it. He doesn't need anything. God is radically, what do they say? Ase. He's not, contingent or dependent on us for anything. And that's not how they thought about their Greek gods. They thought their Greek gods needed to be cared for. They believed that the Greek gods created humans to do the work for them so they didn't have to do the work all the time, including feeding them these sacrifices that nourish them. You know, it's a very...
The gods were very dependent. Their gods were very dependent.
They needed a bunch of slaves to do all the hard work of cultivating the lands, raising the animals, planting the vegetables, do all the things so that they could be properly cared for and fed. And if you didn't do that, then they messed with you. They stopped the rain, or they brought war, or whatever. You know, so that's the kind of thing he's coming against here. And he says, look, the God who made the world and everything in it, Lord of heaven and earth, does not need temples. This is a radical message. I mean, it's just like, you're in a city. Like, now that I've been there, like, I've literally seen the temples with my own eyes. They're still there.
Wow.
They're still there, Tom.
Wow.
Remnants.
Amazing.
There's actually, when I was there, was scaffolding all around it. You know, they're always restoring these things because of the weather. Erosion and whatnot, but you know, massive structures, unquestionable. You don't go to a ancient Greek city and say, God doesn't need temples.
Yeah,
you know, that really get their attention. It's like, wow, what is this guy saying?
Imagine, So what would it, like, these temples were full of pillars, and
yes,
I mean, the structure would have been probably unprecedented structures.
I mean, we're looking at structures that are so impressive that if you didn't live in a city, if you lived somewhere out in the country, you came to a city, it would just take your breath away. And then going into the temple itself, seeing most of these temples, they have what's called an apse, which is kind of like the back curved area where they had the statue itself. And to see, you know, this huge statue, you know, the artistry was magnificent.
Yeah.
And you know, I've seen this where I think I saw this in a museum in Ephesus on site. They have a little Ephesus museum there, and they had the head of Domitian, which is a Roman emperor, and it looked like a baby head. The proportions were all wrong. You know, just, you know how like baby heads look weird? I don't know really how to describe it. Like they're maybe a little squat.
Compared to the rest of the body, you mean?
No, not. It was just the head.
Just the head.
Just the head, and it looked like a baby head. Okay. And I asked my teacher. I was a part of a class at Boston University. I asked my teacher, I'm like, "What's the deal with this? Why does it look like a baby head?" And he just kind of laughed a little bit, and he said, "Get low. Imagine this being 20 feet up in the air. Change your perspective and look at it again." And it was exactly right. If you got low and looked at that same head of Domitian, from that angle that you would see it from the ground, all the proportions were perfect.
So it was designed to be looked up to.
Right.
Wow.
So we're looking at people that have the artistry, the skill, to you know, to like factor in perspective and angle. You know what I mean? Like that's something I would never think of. You know, of course I'm not a sculptor, but you know, I mean, you come in and you're confronted by this stone object that is beautifully done.
Yeah.
It just takes your breath away. For anyone to question it would just be like, what are you talking about, man? Everybody believes in this. And then there's a parade where they bring, you know, the portable idols through the city, and then they end up out front of the temple, and you get a big barbecue, and everybody's rejoicing.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, the Jews and the Christians are just like, we're not going. We're going to stay home.
Free meat, right? And they're
well, free meat for the pagans, right?
Yeah, for the pagans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you happen to know the story about the Roman general? Was it Pompeii, that when he came into Jerusalem and he was going to go into the holiest of holies, and the priests were standing in the way, and he ordered several of them killed with a sword? He wanted to see what the God of Israel looked like.
Yeah.
And he entered into the holiest of holies after these priests gave their life, and he found nothing. What a surprise, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
so that Paul is preaching the same unseen God, but he's preaching the Jewish Messiah who was seen, who was raised from the dead, exalted into heaven, and whom God made judge over the earth. So this is, the Athenians are being told that this Jesus, God gave authority for judgment, and that the world will be judged by him.
Yeah, even before that, just talking about how you mentioned that Paul quoted a couple of their poets, right?
Mm-hmm.
That in him we move and have our being, we live and move and have our being, and the other statement, for we indeed are his offspring.
Yes.
There's a lot of, depends on how deep you want to go in this, Tom, but there's a lot going on with the schools of the philosophers.
Delve into it. Sure, please.
Okay, so you have the Epicureans, founded by Epicurus, and then you have the Stoics, founded by Zeno, and they are just like total opposites, right? So the goal of the Epicurean is to seek pleasure, but not in a primitive spring break frat party way, where you just go crazy and then you're in pain and suffering the next morning. That's amateur hour for the Epicureans are maximizing pleasure over the course of your entire life.
Okay.
What would maximize my pleasure? Okay. And the Epicureans tended to say that either the gods don't exist or they exist but they don't care about us. So, you don't need to worry about the gods. There's a lot of precursors to modern atheism and agnosticism there. But the Stoics are saying, oh, pleasure is bad, and you got to serve the gods, you have civil duty. The Stoics tended to be the ones in charge of the cities, and the Stoics are absolutely convinced that pleasure is inherently sinful. Like any kind of pursuit of bodily pleasure is, well, I would say at least questionable, but probably if you could really live without food that tastes really good, or beds that are nice and soft, or a woman's touch, or a man's touch if you're a woman, that you would be happier. You would live the good life. So the philosophers are all about, Greek philosophers in particular, are all about how do you lead the good life. Then you have the Cynics, which are not mentioned here, so we don't need to get into the Cynics. But the Stoics and the Epicureans, they have their own view about the gods. The Epicureans are convinced that gods don't care about people. Why? Because the good life is characterized by maximizing pleasure. And what pleasure could a god possibly gain by being at all aware of the miseries in the human world? So therefore the gods are out to lunch where they don't exist. Whereas the Stoics are like, no, the gods exist, and they are very much involved, but they're punishing, in tune with this mindset of pleasure being wrong, or questionable. I'll just add one other thing here. There's a lot about the logos in Stoicism. In Stoicism, the logos is let me picture it this way. Imagine you are a dog tied by a rope on the back of an ox cart. You can pull, you can bark, you can protest and just freeze up your limbs, but wherever that ox is pulling the ox cart, you're going. So the Stoic is saying, walk with the ox cart in the direction that the ox is going. That's the logos. So the logos is kind of pulling or pushing everything along in a certain direction, and you're the dog tied to the back of it, so you want to go with fate or logos into the predetermined direction that everything is going already.
Oh.
Right? So there's a lot of philosophical stuff, baggage, ideas going on here that Paul is, he would be aware to some degree, but he's bringing this Jewish message about a crucified and risen hero who is now appointed to this exalted role from which he's going to come and rule the world. It's very political.
So when
non-philosophical, he's not engaging with any of their philosophical focuses. He doesn't talk about pleasure. He doesn't talk about fate. He's just like an alien coming in here, and they don't know what to do with him. They're just resurrection.
Right. So when he projects Jesus, he's talking about a human being that entirely of his own free will offered himself up in order to gain life for himself and for the rest of humanity. And for that reason, God exalted him and made him judge over all of humanity. So this is really strange stuff to them.
It just would have sounded so like weird and irrelevant.
Yes.
Right? It just, but then a couple people believe, right?
Yeah.
Damaris and Demetrius, right?
Was it Dionysius?
Dionysius and Damaris, yeah.
What does the name mean, Dionysius? Any idea?
Dionysus. So a lot of times what you do is you put a little I in the end of the last syllable of a name to make it for a human. So Dionysus is the god. Dionysius is a human named after the god. Dionysus is the god of partying.
Really?
Equivalent to Bacchus, the Roman god. So Dionysus is the god of wine and parties and orgies and just...
that's interesting. That would make quite a conversion, wouldn't it?
Well, it doesn't mean that this guy was into
that
that
he was
lifestyle,
necessarily. But,
But that's just what the god was known for. He's kind of like the patron god of feasting and partying and whatnot. You can imagine he was a very popular god to worship.
Yeah, I imagine, especially for the Epicureans, if they happen to worship a god, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so could you comment a little bit on the first, say, 200 years of Christianity, and maybe when was the martyrdom of Perpetua, and was it Felicity? Yeah.
Felicitas or
what kind of
Felicity? I think that's the name we get from it. Yeah.
Okay. They were two different individuals that were martyred at the same time. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, they were.
So what would their faith have been? Like, how would you frame it with respect to the gospel that Paul was preaching?
Okay. So the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas, or Felicity, occurred in Carthage, right?
Okay.
So Carthage is North Africa, and I know that it was 3rd century. I'm not sure when exactly. I'm just looking up about it right now. Yeah, like early 3rd century, so like 203. So this is kind of like a really interesting period in time, the 3rd century. It's, we happen to know a lot about Carthage, Carthaginian Christianity from Tertullian.
Oh, okay.
Because Tertullian wrote in the 190s, 170s, 190s, and early 200s up until about like 213. Yeah, yeah, and he's from that area. And so Tertullian would be like the main guy to go to if you want to know what, at least upper crust Christians thought about things. And, by his time, there were some developments that were already occurring. And, I'm not really 100% sure what he believed about the afterlife. I've seen some reports, like ancient Christian reports, saying, Tertullian believed in the kingdom. I think that's certainly possible. But I think he also held a very philosophically mainstream view of the soul. The souls are immortal, go up to heaven. I think he was already in that direction, if not wholly embracing that. And as far as like Jesus and God and stuff like that go, he holds to a very physical doctrine of the Trinity. Like he's actually the first
that coined
Latin person to use the word Trinitas, which is the word Trinity. But Tertullian's Trinity has sort of like a God substance, and the Father has more of it than the Son, and the Son has more of it than the Spirit. Oh. So I always can imagine it as like a what do you call a fertilized egg? An embryo. Okay. So like an embryo, like a single cell, and then it divides, and then it divides again, right? So like, except usually with cells they divide equally, right? But in this case, you have this single cell called the Father, and a little portion of it divides off, and that becomes the Son. Okay. And a little portion of that becomes the Spirit. So like, there's less divine substance in the Son than there is in the Father. It's a very different way of thinking about any of this than what we've just been talking about with the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
And so I think Tertullian was kind of like later on, more than 100 years after Christ, 170 years after Christ.
Okay.
And so it could be that Perpetua and Felicitas had some ideas about that. But one of the most interesting quotes from Tertullian is that he talks about the threeness, and he's super concerned that other Christians in his area will find it hard to believe that they are preferring oneness to threeness.
That most Christians prefer oneness to threeness.
Yeah, in his local area. So I think, you have to be careful. Like, just because somebody's writing Survive doesn't mean they characterize everyone in that area. Like, I'm a pastor. I'm very realistic on this. Like, there are people in my church that have wildly different beliefs than I hold and that I teach. And they've come for decades. And they just, for whatever reason, they have their beliefs and they don't want to change them. Most people change over time, hearing, or they go to another church, right? But, there's some people that they're just like, well, I'm going to stick with this, and that's it, So it doesn't even matter if you're necessarily a leader. It doesn't mean everyone else believes that too. So when you ask me about Perpetua and Felicitas from the same town, the same part of North Africa, I'm going to think of Tertullian because he wrote around this time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they 100% were on board with his philosophical speculations. Okay? They could have been one of the people that were just like, I don't know what Brother Tertullian's on about. And he eventually got pretty radical because he joined up with the Montanists and took a very a very Stoic view where he started saying that, you shouldn't even have sex within marriage.
Wow.
That you should live with your wife as if she's your sister. And this is, again, going back to our earlier point about the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians, that if only we had our Jewish brothers still involved and engaged, a lot of the shenanigans with weird sexual views that permeated early Christianity in the 2nd century onwards, we could have combated. Instead, we ended up with priests who don't get married, and now the priest is going to officiate a marriage, and the priest has never been married. And then the priest is going to teach you how to be a parent, and the priest has never raised children. You read the New Testament, man. It says a bishop has to be the husband of a wife, and he has to have kids that are, right? I mean, where did all this come from? Well, these were Greco-Roman ideas in the culture that kind of crept into Christianity. We didn't have that Jewish antidote within the body of Christ to fight off.
Yeah, what a pity.
These,
what a pity.
Ascetic sensibilities.
Well, we have to pray for a revival.
Anyhow, these two. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We have to pray for a revival among our Jewish brethren in Israel, that many would come to Messiah according to the first century Nazarene perspective. I've met a few. I interviewed one. So may God bring it to pass.
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyhow, on Perpetua and Felicitas, just a brief story about them is that they got arrested. This is probably one of the clearest and most powerful examples of Christians recognizing heroism and courage in women that you can find in ancient times, where basically these women are the heroes of the story. They're the ones that very boldly face down just terrible torture. And, they hold themselves with poise. One of them's a slave. and the other is a noblewoman.
Yeah.
And it's just this beautiful example of Christian women who are going to they're going to be respectful to the authority and defiant at the same time.
Amazing.
I just love it. It's so powerful. It's anybody can just be like, I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm not going to listen.
Right.
It's childish rebellion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, anyone can just, show respect and never have the courage to stand up for their faith and just become a sycophant, right? But these women, they're just like, no, I can't go with you on this, but I'm still going to call you sir. And then defy you by not bowing to Caesar's image and holding true to Christ. It's incredible, powerful example to all of us.
So I think one thing we can take away from this is that they held that Jesus was Lord, like the only one to whom you should bow and serve among the sons of humanity. Is that safe to say? Like Jesus, not Caesar.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's there's so much going on here politically, and we have clear statements in the New Testament to show proper honor and respect to the emperor, to those in authority, whether emperor or provincial governors. We have clear statements to pay our taxes, but Caesar is not content to be the ruler of the Roman Empire. He wants to be Lord. He wants. Yes. I think he claims, in the Christian's view, he was claiming more than just political power. Mm-hmm. And so my suspicion is that that's really where the conflict comes in, because Christians die for this left and right.
Yeah.
So it's not a minor. It's not like a difference of how to say things correctly. It's considered to be a major issue, but usually it's the idea of offering incense to the genius of Caesar, which is kind of like this spirit.
Oh,
I don't know if it's an ancestral spirit or what, but like there's some other stuff going on other than just politics.
Okay.
And what they're asking them to do, and they're refusing, and they're saying, "Nah, I'm not going to swear by the genius of Caesar." Genius is like a spirit. It's not like being really smart. I'm sorry if that's confusing.
No. It makes sense. Just briefly, does this go back to the Caesar cult worship from Asia Minor?
Yeah. I mean, cult worship it's already getting big. They're already starting to recognize, this title, Son of God. We have this inscription from Priene, a city from ancient, modern day Turkey, but ancient Asia, right? And in this inscription, they talk about Octavius, that he is a son of God, changed his name to Augustus, the first emperor. I would say Julius Caesar was not really an emperor, but certainly the first Caesar.
Yes.
But Octavian, his successor, becomes the first real emperor who actually wields the power without getting stabbed to death for it. And he defeats Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium, and he is hailed as a son of God. And the people in the city of Priene say, you know what, we're gonna restart our calendar based on your birthday.
Is that where it started? In that city?
And of course, to this day, the month of August hails back to Augustus and this whole thing. But so they start giving living Caesars authority and honor that is beyond just a political office.
Okay.
And that really just, for Jews and Christians, it's just like, it's too cringy. It's too much for us to admit to that authority. We'll admit that God has put in authority those who are in authority, but we can't say beyond that.
Right.
To say, okay, well, there's some metaphysical, whatever reality occurring here that we need to bow the knee to. It's too much.
Yes.
And a lot of it had to do with sacrifice, because sacrifice is worship. And, the Christians never offered any sacrifices to anyone other than God. And by then, in the very early days, I think Christians were still offering sacrifices in the temple, even after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, because I don't think the understanding that the book of Hebrews explains was immediately clear. I think it took time for Christians, Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians to be like, oh, okay, the sacrifice has been given once for all. So I think that understanding was already starting to be present before the temple got destroyed, but it's a moot point afterwards, because after the year 70, there are no sacrifices to this day.
Right.
For the Jewish people or for Christians.
Yeah, the Jews had to reformat their religion in order to accommodate that reality, right?
Right.
So that's Rabbinic Judaism is the byproduct of that?
Yes. Rabbinic Judaism is the successor of the Pharisees. And, what we see with Rabbinic Judaism is a focus, just like the Pharisees, a focus on Torah observance rather than a focus on temple and sacrifices. Not that Pharisees didn't believe in those things, but that was more the purview of the Sadducees in the first century. So rather than the worship of God through sacrificing of animals, the worship of God through mitzvot, the commandments on mitzvot.
Okay. So our friend Rabbi Tovia Singer would be speaking from that perspective.
Well, I mean, he's a lot of centuries later. So you've also got the two Talmuds, just to throw that in there, two Talmuds, and then medieval wisdom and Judaism, Nachmanides. I mean, there's a lot.
Yes.
And then, the movement in this country, I don't know if Tovia is from...
Brooklyn, New York.
Okay, so he's one of my people.
Yeah.
From New York. Oh, I'm up in Albany, so it's a little different. But, so there was a division in Judaism where Judaism in this country started to go a little liberal, and that's called Reform Judaism.
Reform Judaism, yep.
Yeah, and so there's a reaction against that with Orthodox Judaism. And then you have the Via Media, the middle way of conservative Judaism. Mm-hmm. And then lots of little smaller groups and movements in that. So, look, to get from the Pharisees to Tovia Singer is...
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I don't know how much...
It's interesting how Christianity is argued against as if it's monolithic from the Jewish perspective, but the Jews are not monolithic either, neither Christians nor Jews.
If you want to really complicate it, think about Israel for a minute.
Yes.
Okay, so in Israel, almost everybody's Orthodox, and a lot of people don't even believe in God. So, like in America, it's a little simpler. Like among Reform Judaism, there are more, devout practices where people are they believe in God, but maybe it's a little different than traditional. Okay, But then there's others that are just, it's just culture, it's just tradition. We gotta understand that, because in Christianity we have the same thing. It's called the mainline denominations. You can find atheists in mainline denominations that just like the choir and stuff, and just grew up with it. Right? We have that on a kind of like our left wing of Christianity, just like Judaism has. But then in Israel, it's all Orthodox, but it's just a whole other bag over there, a whole other way of thinking about it. It's I love all this stuff. It's fascinating. It's not my field of expertise, so you have to forgive me if I'm simplifying it a little bit, because my focus is more on ancient Christianity.
Yes. Well, we've had a very good discussion. It's almost an hour and 40 minutes now. I think I'd like to give you an opportunity to close out and to give some thoughts, like based on what you've learned doing this series on the first 500 years of Christianity. What is your advice? What is your vision looking forward for the restoration of first century Christianity? Yeah.
Of course, I could talk about early church history for a long time, Tom, so I don't know if this is a good question to land the plane on. So just interrupt me when I get going too
Yeah, no.
Too much.
No.
All right. Well, I think we've already stated pretty clearly the motive that drives me. It's the same motive that drives you, and it's this impulse that says Christianity has gotten off track, so we want to get back to the earlier form of Christianity, apostolic, the Christianity at the time of the apostles, as far as the beliefs that we can find in the New Testament, and read the New Testament from a first century perspective, so that we're misreading it from a 21st century perspective or American perspective, or just a technological perspective that they didn't have. So that's really the impulse that's driving me. And so as a result of that, I have been so curious about how Christianity developed. And I remember I used to ride the train from Providence to Boston every day with this Mormon guy named Hans. Great guy. And he was telling me, oh, it's fascinating, you're studying early church history. I said, yeah, Hans, I'm into it. I'm curious about it. He says, oh, well, we Mormons, we believe that the church completely fell away right after the apostles and didn't get reformed or rediscovered until Joseph Smith.
Oh, wow.
And I was just like, Hans, baby, there's just no way. There's just no way. You can't, I mean, there's no institutional church yet. There's no powerful centralizing authority to force anyone to do anything or to think anything. It's all based on persuasion. And if you look at the 2nd century, it's the Wild West. You got Gnostics, you got Marcionites, you got Valentinians, you got philosopher types like Justin, you've got more down-to-earth type Christians, you've got the Jewish Christians, you've got all these things all at the same time, separated by great distances.
Yes.
And people don't travel like we travel today. They don't travel like that in the ancient world.
Right.
There's no communication other than if you can convince a traveler to carry a letter. It costs you big money to have written. Right? So, I mean, there's just no way to force everyone to fall away from original Christianity very fast. It's got to be a slow process and uneven, where in some areas, they're still holding to this view that has already started to develop differently in other areas. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure it does.
So I think
Absolutely.
I was able to show that not that was like what I was trying to prove or anything, it's just an observation, that when you look at all the different strands, and what I do is I cover it topically. So I'll just like one lecture on the Gnostics. And when I do the Gnostics, my goal is not to blast the Gnostics and say, what a bunch of idiots. How do they believe in this crazy stuff? No, that's not the goal. You have to take a look at my Gnostic lecture to see what you think, if you think I succeeded. My goal is to present it on its own terms so you understand what it is. And if anything, I want you to understand the attraction, the pull of Gnosticism, which I don't know if I really succeeded at that.
You did succeed. You did succeed.
Gnosticism was so attractive that for decades, maybe even centuries, Christians wrote books against it. Right? Why do we have so many of these heresiologies where it talks about the Gnostics? Because it was a real issue that Christians were facing in their local churches, and they're hearing about in other churches where people are getting taken out into the Gnostic world and saying, you know what, you guys are fine, but you're a little primitive. You're not really up on Plato. No offense. But like what you're saying doesn't really jive with, the cutting edge, education of today.
Yes.
Whereas the Gnostics was just like, oh man, it sounded so good. So that's what I'm trying to do, whether I'm talking about the Gnostics or Origen or Philo or Clement of Alexandria or whatever, is I'm trying to put the listener, or if you watch it, the viewer, in tune, put you into that world and do it in a way that's based on the primary sources so that you can hear them in their own words. And this is common in the academy. Okay, in the universities, yes, this is standard. University will take it to another level, in their own words, exactly, not in their own words translated into English, because that's amateur hour. You
Okay.
should really have a full command of classical Latin and classical Greek if you're going to do business with the early church fathers.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's way too much to expect of a popular audience, to do that. But in most churches, in most just like even books, right? People are telling the story of Christianity all the time. And what they're not doing is letting those early Christians speak for themselves, or those early heretics speak for themselves, because then you can characterize them however you want. So that was a big part of motive behind my class, was to show people, put people into their world. And it was really like an intro where I was anticipating that people who take this early Christian history class or early church, what do they call it? Early church history, that they would then be able to do their own research, and they would be able to get like a lay of the land with my lecture, and then be able to say, okay, well, let's follow up on some of these books that I mentioned in the class itself, so that they could do their own research, because it's hard for me to predict what somebody's really interested in.
So,
right?
So when you talk,
I tried to cover everything in a survey mode where you could get a little understanding.
Yeah. So you talked about vectors, and what you're doing is you're trying to allow us to trace these vectors back to its like the original source, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I think you can see that in this class, especially, like I do a lot with Christology. I didn't want to like just only focus on that because there's so much other stuff. But like Christology really becomes such a big deal in the 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th centuries. So, but especially the 4th and 5th centuries in particular, that I wanted to be able to, and I knew that was coming, so I wanted to like hit the precursors along the way. And I think you can really see that development very clearly in the class that I did. But also, there was always a minority. There was always another group of Christians that were like, yeah, I don't think so.
Right.
Right. Like even in the 4th century, you have Photinus of Sirmium, right? And he's a bishop, and he's a biblical Unitarian. He doesn't even believe in the pre-existence of Jesus, and he's a bishop. He's a recognized bishop in a major city where a lot of creeds get developed. Or Paul of Samosata before him in Smyrna, right? So like he's such a big deal over there. And then you have other important Christians who live outside the Roman Empire. Here, I just offer a little teaser. I don't know when this episode you're planning to air it, but I interviewed Sam Tiedemann on the subject of Afrahat. Have you ever heard of Afrahat?
No, I don't
All
think
right,
so.
this would be great. You're gonna love this.
Okay.
All right, so this is an episode for Restitudio I haven't released yet.
Okay.
It'll be out in 2 weeks, so who knows when that'll be compared to your schedule.
Yeah, I hope to have this out sooner than that.
Okay, so whenever it comes out. But so Afrahat is living in Persia. He's writing in Syriac. He's approaching everything from a very Eastern point of view. And he says if you run into some Jews, this is in 17 of his demonstrations. Excuse me. If you run into some Jews that ask you the question, why do you call Jesus God? And why do you worship Jesus? This is what you should say to them. Afrahat says, you should say to them, we call Jesus God because God has seen fit to give the title of divinity to exceptional humans like Moses, who's also called God.
Oh, wow.
We worship Jesus because God has seen fit to give that honor to humans who are deserving of it. And then he gives other examples of Israelite kings or other individuals in their own Persian society that you would take the knee before. You're not believing they're God, but you are worshiping that person in this like lower sense of bowing and so forth.
Okay.
And it's like, wow, this is an incredible testimony. It's from the year 340.
Oh.
But it's not in the Roman Empire. It's in Persia.
Yeah.
And we have very little from Persia from this period because eventually the Muslims come.
Yep.
And you don't have the copying continuing by the monks and the monasteries and so forth, because it becomes Muslim overnight.
Yeah.
Right? But
Yeah.
this is a witness to a Christology that is either biblical Unitarian with no preexistence, or it's subordinationist Unitarian where you do have preexistence, but it's clear that there's still only one God at the top.
Yeah.
Either way, it's a very Unitarian Christology coming out of Christian. And Afrahat's no small guy. You know, he's a monk, but he's of some significance.
Very interesting. Yeah, so who knows outside the Roman Empire what the numbers are, actually, of biblical Unitarians.
Yeah.
Could be staggering. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, certainly the Germans that eventually conquered the Roman Empire, they were non-Trinitarian, you know, for a long time. I covered that.
Yeah, I remember
the Aryan kingdoms, yeah.
Yes. Just out of
Nobody
curiosity.
knows about that one either, Tom.
Yeah, well, you revealed it. Thank you. I'm just curious to know, like, do you have any idea how many hours it took to prepare for this 500-year?
Oh, that's unanswerable because you know this is my field of study. You know?
Yeah.
So you know my I don't know if I had done much before I got to I can tell you exactly. The first exposure I think I mentioned this in the first episode in the introduction of this class. I was at the Atlanta Bible College in Georgia, and I took a block class, a 1 week long block class, and a professor came in. I think his name was Jim Graham, if I remember correctly, out of Arizona, and he covered the Justo Gonzalez book on early church history. And I remember him just like talking about all this stuff, and me thinking to myself, "What are you talking about? Who are these people? Like I've never heard of it. Like it was just like a whole new field." And I'm like, why doesn't anybody else talk about these names and these ideas and like what? Why is this hidden? But like in evangelical and most Protestant Christianity, we do not do church history. We do Bible, we do theology, you know, but we'll do a lot of apologetics.
Yeah, you might learn about John Calvin or Martin Luther or something like that, right? Perhaps. Okay.
Maybe.
So you had an interest from very early age.
Yeah, so, you know,
you've just
however
been
many hours
accumulating.
that class was, and then you had part 2 of that class, and then after that I was like, you know, this stuff is super fascinating. And I remember at Boston University, I just, you know, really focused on it, and I took every class I could at Boston University, Boston College, and Harvard on the subject of early Christian history, because it was just like not a major field at any of those universities. So I was just like taking a class here and a class there and just like kind of making my own program in a sense.
So you went to Harvard University as well?
Yes.
You attended classes there. Okay, because that's...
I mean, I went... I didn't apply and get in, but you know, when you're in Boston University, or if you're in any Boston theology school, you can cross-register to other schools. So I was a BU student, but I was actually attending classes at these other schools.
Interesting. Wow.
And at Harvard is where I learned most of what I know about Philo, and some of what I know about Origen, because we read Philo in Greek. Well, we read Plato in Greek and then Philo in Greek. So we read Plato's Timaeus and then Philo's De Officio Mundi, which means on the creation of the world, or on the works of the world. So we're reading these things in such a way that like you see the influence of one on the other.
Okay.
So if that makes any sense. So I don't know how many hours I've spent on church history, but like, you know, there's a lot in the background. But even so, I did a lot of fresh research for this class.
That's what I was kind of interested in knowing, like in preparation for this class. You read several books. I mean, you must have been engrossed for hours upon hours and taking notes and then trying to synthesize all this down for your audience.
Yeah, and you know, I had to buy a lot of books too. You know, I probably spent over $1,000 in books just to do this class, because, you know, I'm trying to get those primary sources.
Yes.
And a lot of times, the only the only thing available is like those old 1800s translations that are in the public domain.
Mm-hmm.
But scholarship has done a lot, and a more modern translation is going to be based on better manuscripts or more manuscripts. And so I'm trying to give people the best,
yes.
not just a lot of times the 1800 stuff is fine, but like I wanted the most up to date versions that scholarship was doing, and I also have full access. Well, I wouldn't say full access. I have good access to most journal articles from attending Boston University as an alum. I still have access, so I'm able to access journal articles. Which sometimes, you find an article that's like from this very year. Sometimes it's an article from 10 years ago, 20. But like those articles a lot of times would be my window into a subject where then I could look at their footnotes, look at their sources and be like, okay, this is the version of this that we're using these days.
Wow.
As opposed to what was cool happening 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank the Lord and you for your efforts in bringing this 500-year history and for all your insights.
Did you enjoy the class?
I did.
Good.
I think it's probably more enjoyable to listen to an episode a week than trying to cram 8 episodes into, or 6 episodes into a day. But but that's it like to be able to retain. I mean, I guess it gives. There's a difference between getting a feel for the stuff and actually being able to retain it. So, I mean, this is something obviously you've been thinking about a lot over the last, how long? 20 years, 15, 20 years.
Well, and I've taught a similar version of this class at the Atlanta Bible College. I've done a lot with it over time. So this is like iteration upon iteration, development upon development. And just kind of like this is the next level of it. I think probably previous versions were like 15 sessions long. This one was what, 22?
21 or 22 was it?
So we're talking about a lot more added material, and the area where I've always like had as the greatest weakness has been in the East and in the South, where I just didn't. Just because of the way Christian education happens or church history education, like the focus is always on Europe. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to like really expand beyond that, getting into barbarian kingdoms, which is still European, but then also getting into the African kingdom of Axum in Ethiopia, and learning a lot about the Armenians. I actually did a project last year on Armenian church history, so I've got like a whole library of Armenian church history books, and I've got a lot of familiarity with that now, which is really helpful for this class. And then Asian Christianity I was just blown away by. I got a couple of really good books on that with like really good primary sources where they would quote the originals and really help me to see what was going on in India.
And I found that particularly fascinating. And the
I was
idea,
just like, wow, this stuff. Because like I always hear, okay, Thomas is in India. You ask any Indian person, that's what they say, and you're like, but is there any actual evidence for that?
Well, you actually demonstrated that there were actually ships that were making their way out there and back, big ships.
Yes, that blew my mind.
Yeah.
Like this was
with the right winds.
In the Roman Empire, you could live. In the Roman Empire, you could live 10 miles away from another village and never visit because of there's not a road that goes between the two, or they don't have a commodity that you need, right, and you just never visit, right. Whereas at this very same period you could end up going thousands of miles from the Red Sea to Sri Lanka or India. And that was happening on like a regular basis, that trade route. It's incredible.
I compared what you had to say. Well, I have a pretty famous ancestor who was the governor of South Carolina. He had a plantation, the Middleton Plantation. I'm not really proud of him. He was a slave owner and so forth.
Okay. Well, that's a bummer.
Yeah. His name is Arthur Middleton. He actually signed the Declaration of Independence. And his plantation is right along a river that goes out to Charleston. And what would happen, the tide goes out from that place, the tide goes out in the morning, and it comes in the evening. So he would load his ships, his river boats up with their goods. The tide would take the goods with the slaves that were taking it to market in the morning. They would load the same ships up with dainties for the plantation, and the tide would bring them back in the evening. So it was like a perfect setting to conduct that kind of trade, and it was, just excellent for business. And you were talking about the winds that carry ships out to India at one season and carry them back in the other direction. Yeah. It was kind of like, it just reminded me of that kind of scenario where the weather currents were just the perfect match for the kind of trade that was going on. Yeah.
Yeah. So
really,
let me just encourage your audience for a second that if you want to know the inside scoop of what happened in early Christianity, check out my class, Early Church History.
Amen. That's good.
And it'll at least give you an introduction. And then you can use whatever resources that you have available or buy some books on it and really delve into your subject so that you understand it better and you can understand what was going on. Mm-hmm. Because, it's investigative and it's exciting to learn. And, we didn't really get into this, Tom, but there's also so many, well, maybe with Perpetua Felicitas, but there's so many inspiring individuals and events that occurred that I just carry with me.
Yes. Right. So it's
and
a rich,
so many
rich
deplorable,
culture.
Horrifying situations that remind me not to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Right.
Yeah, we've got actual practical benefit to this.
Yes, Sean. We got some examples on both sides. Very, very distinct examples on both sides. Well, may God bless you. May He provide for you in your ministry and enable you to continue the wonderful work you're doing. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure, and I know for a fact many have appreciated it. Your podcast, Restitudio, was really instrumental for my own faith journey because you're not afraid to tackle so many very difficult subjects that no one else is willing to talk about and things that really need to be reasoned through and compared to the biblical sources, the truth that we have in God's Word. So God bless you, Sean. Thank the Lord and you for your time as well.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.